On a gray morning in October of 2019, every farmer in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, was doing what they had always done. They were watching their fields go empty. The combines had finished their runs. The soybeans were in the elevator. The corn was sold. And now the ground lay bare and dark and flat in every direction, all the way to the horizon, waiting for winter to take it. Nobody covered it. Nobody planted anything into it. Nobody even talked about doing otherwise. The ground went bare in October, and it stayed bare until April, and that was simply how it was done. The same way it had been done by their fathers and their fathers before them, back through the generations to when this county was first broken and planted and named. Let me tell you about Pottawatomie County, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. This is flat country, not rolling, not gently undulating. Flat in the way that makes first-time visitors from the coasts feel something close to vertigo, the way the land just goes and goes without interruption until the sky finally stops it. The soil here is deep and dark and rich, the kind of soil that built the American grain economy, the kind that smells like something alive when you turn it in the spring. Farmers here grew wheat in the winter historically, but by the 2000s, most operations in the county had converted heavily to corn and soybean rotations, following the commodity prices, following the advice of the Extension Office, following each other. The county had about 340 active farm operations. The Delgado family ran one of them. Hector Delgado had farmed the same 800 acres in the northeastern corner of the county for 31 years. His father had farmed it before him for 22 years, and his grandfather had worked the same ground as a tenant before that. The Delgados were not the biggest operation in the county. They were not the most modern. They ran a pair of John Deere row-crop tractors that were 12 years old and a combine that had been purchased used. Hector kept his equipment maintained and his books balanced and his yields within a few bushels per acre of the county average, and he considered that a success. He was 54 years old and had the kind of face that comes from decades of squinting into the Kansas sun, weathered and creased but not unhappy. He wore the same canvas jacket from October through March. He drank his coffee black. He did not waste words. His daughter Nora was 22 years old in the fall of 2019. She had just finished her degree in soil science at Kansas State University in Manhattan, where she had studied under a professor named Dr. Carolyn Whitfield, who had spent 30 years researching soil health and cover cropping systems across the Central Plains. Nora had come home for the summer after her junior year and had not left. She had told her father she wanted to farm. Hector had said, quietly and without cruelty, that there was not much money in it. Nora had said she knew. He had looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once, and that was that. Let me tell you about Nora Delgado because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from most of the characters this kind of story is usually told about. She was not old. She was not male. She did not have 30 years of calloused hands and accumulated failure to give her authority. What she had was a notebook, a green spiral-bound notebook that she had filled during her senior year with research notes, field trial data, extension bulletins from Nebraska and Minnesota, and 3 years of correspondence with Dr. Whitfield about cover cropping systems in semi-arid environments. She had the kind of mind that retained numbers the way other people retain faces. She could tell you the nitrogen fixation rate of hairy vetch at 45 days post-emergence. She could tell you the rooting depth of cereal rye versus winter wheat at 90 days. She could tell you the per-acre revenue differential between a bare-fallow corn-soy rotation and a rotation that incorporated cover crops and one alternative cash crop, and she could cite the Kansas State trial data and the University of Nebraska data and the on-farm trials from 3 counties in Iowa to back it up. She had done the math. She had done it carefully, and she had done it more than once, and every time she came out in the same place. She brought it to the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late September of 2019, 3 weeks before the combines finished their last pass. Hector was eating. Her mother, Rosa, was at the counter. Nora set the notebook on the table, opened to a page that showed a hand-drawn comparison chart, bare-fallow versus cereal rye cover crop versus a diversified rotation including sunflowers, with 3 years of trial data from a farm in Salem County, Missouri, annotated in her careful handwriting. She said she wanted to plant 120 acres of cereal rye as a cover crop this fall, right after the soybeans came off, and she wanted to try 80 acres of sunflowers in the rotation the following spring on the ground that had been in continuous corn for 4 years. Hector chewed. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the chart. He set down his fork and picked up the notebook and read the numbers the way a man reads a contract. Slowly, looking for the catch. Rosa turned from the counter and watched him. He set the notebook down. He said he needed to think about it. Rosa said, quietly, without looking up from the sink, that Nora was right, and that he knew she was right, and that thinking about it was just a way of deciding not to decide. Hector looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He picked up his fork again. He said he would think about it tonight. Let me tell you about the science, because the science is the reason Nora's notebook existed and the reason she was so certain, and you cannot understand her certainty without understanding what she had found. Cereal rye, not the grain crop, but the same species planted as a cover crop, is one of the most cold-hardy plants in the agricultural world. It will germinate in soil temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It will keep growing in conditions that kill almost everything else. Planted in October after a soybean harvest, it establishes a root system that reaches 18 to 24 inches into the soil by January. Those roots hold the topsoil in place through the freeze-thaw cycles that otherwise cause erosion. They capture residual nitrogen left from the soybean crop, nitrogen that would otherwise leach down below the root zone over the winter and be gone by spring. When the rye is terminated in April before planting corn or soybeans, it decomposes and releases that nitrogen back into the top 6 inches of soil, where the cash crop can use it. The numbers from Dr. Whitfield's research and from the Kansas State trials were not ambiguous. Fields with cereal rye cover crops showed 40 to 60% reductions in soil erosion compared to bare-fallow. They showed 15 to 25 pounds per acre of additional available nitrogen in the spring, which translated to reduced fertilizer costs of between $18 and $31 per acre, depending on the year's nitrogen price. They showed improved water infiltration. Cover-cropped fields absorbed rainfall at nearly twice the rate of bare fields, which in a drought year meant the difference between a crop that survived and a crop that didn't. And on the revenue side, the Salem County trial data showed that farms running a corn-soy sunflower rotation with cover crops between every cash crop were generating $47 to $63 more per acre per year than comparable farms running a straight corn-soy rotation on bare fallow ground. On 200 acres, that was somewhere between $9,400 and $12,600 per year in additional net revenue. Over 5 years, it was more money than the combine had cost. Nora had put all of this in the notebook. She had put it in the notebook and she had checked it twice, and she had brought it to the kitchen table, and her father had said he needed to think about it. He came to her the next morning before breakfast and told her she could plant 80 acres of cereal rye after the beans came off the south field. Not 120, 80. And the sunflowers were a conversation for next spring. Nora said that was fine. She did not say it was not enough. She said it was fine, and she meant it because 80 acres was a start, and a start was all she needed. Now, let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because Dale Crowley is the other half of this story, and you need to understand him too. Dale was 61 years old and had been the primary sales representative and unofficial agricultural advisor for Pottawatomie County's largest farm supply cooperative for 22 years. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was not malicious. He was a man who had built his identity around knowing things, around being the person in the county that other farmers came to for advice, and he had been that person for a long time. He held court at the co-op counter every weekday morning from about 7:15 to 8:45, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup and talking to whoever came in. And what he said carried weight in the county because he had been saying things for 22 years, and most of them had turned out to be right. He knew commodity prices. He knew equipment. He knew the extension service recommendations for the county's soil types. What he knew well. What he didn't know, he sometimes didn't know he didn't know. Nora had met Dale Crowley twice before the fall of 2019. Once when she was 12 and came to the co-op with her father. Once when she was home the summer after her sophomore year and had asked Dale about cover crop seed availability for a class project. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he is not sure is serious. He had told her that cover crops were a lot of work for a marginal benefit, and that most of the farmers in the county had looked at them and decided they weren't worth the trouble. He had said this with the certainty of a man who has said the same thing many times and never had reason to revise it. In the first week of October 2019, Nora drove to the co-op to buy cereal rye seed. She needed enough for 80 acres at about 60 pounds per acre, which was roughly 2,400 pounds of seed, which was just under $1,200 at the co-op's price. She had the money. She had saved it from her summer work. She walked in and told Dale what she wanted. Dale asked her what she was planting it for. She told him. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the man standing next to him at the counter, a farmer named Gene Sievert, who ran 1,400 acres just west of the Delgado ground. And he smiled. Not a cruel smile, a smile that had already decided something. He said that cover crops were an interesting idea, and that there were people experimenting with them, but that in Pottawatomie County, the winters were hard enough and the springs were short enough that by the time you terminated the rye and got the field dried out enough to plant, you'd lost 2 weeks of your planting window, and 2 weeks in Kansas in April could cost you more in yield than the cover crop ever saved you in nitrogen. He said this slowly and with the tone of a man doing someone a favor. Gene Sievert nodded along. Dale said he'd hate to see her spend $1,200 on seed and lose more than that on the back end. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene Sievert started chuckling. Not loudly, the quiet chuckle of a man who has been given permission to find something funny. Let me tell you about that laugh, because it matters. It was not the laugh of a man who had studied cover crops and found them wanting. It was not the laugh of a man who had run the numbers and found them incorrect. It was the laugh of a man who had never done either of those things, and who laughed because Dale Crowley had signaled that laughter was appropriate. And because Nora Delgado was 22 years old and had been at Kansas State and had a notebook, and none of those things were the kind of credentials that carried weight at the co-op counter in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in October. The laugh was about who she was, not what she'd said. And that is the most dangerous kind of dismissal, because it never has to engage with the argument. Nora looked at Dale. She said that the termination timing issue was real, and that the Kansas State trials had addressed it directly, and that using a roller crimper to terminate the rye rather than herbicide alone allowed termination and planting in the same operation, compressing the timing window to essentially zero. She said the 2017 trial data from Saline County showed no statistically significant yield drag on corn planted green into terminated rye compared to corn planted into bare ground. She said this clearly and without raising her voice, the way someone says something they have known for a long time. Dale's smile stayed in place, but it got smaller. Gene Sievert had stopped chuckling. Dale said he'd get her the seed. He said he hoped it worked out for her. He said it the way people say things they do not believe. Nora drove home with 2,400 pounds of cereal rye seed in the bed of her father's pickup. She did not say much on the drive. She had known what the co-op would say before she walked in. She had been prepared for it. That did not make it feel better, but it made it feel finished, and finished was enough to move on from. The soybeans came off the south field in the third week of October. Hector ran the combine. Nora followed behind with the drill, planting rye at 60 pounds per acre into the standing stubble, working from the south end of the field to the north. It took her 2 days. The weather was cold and gray, and the wind came out of the northwest the way it does in Kansas in October, flat and relentless. She wore a Carhartt jacket over a flannel shirt and a seed cap pulled low, and she worked until the light was gone both days. And when she finished, she had 80 acres of cereal rye in the ground, and the field looked exactly the same as it had before she started, because the seed was underground and the rye hadn't emerged yet and there was nothing to see. Hector stood at the field edge the evening of the second day and looked at the ground. He said it looked the same. Nora said it wouldn't in 2 weeks. He nodded, and they walked back to the truck. 2 weeks later, the south field had a faint green haze across it. Not dramatic, not the lush green of a summer crop. A pale, thin green, the color of something just deciding to be alive. Nora walked the field and checked the emergence and counted plants per square foot and wrote the numbers in the notebook. The stand was good, 80 to 90% emergence across the field, with some thin spots on the highest ground where the soil had dried fastest. She noted the thin spots and their locations and moved on. The rest of the Delgado ground, 720 acres, lay bare and dark beside it. And all around the Delgado ground, in every direction as far as you could see, the fields of Pottawatomie County lay bare and dark too. And nobody thought anything of it, because that was what fields looked like in November in Kansas, and that was what they were supposed to look like, and the idea that they might look otherwise had not occurred to most of the people who farmed them. Let me tell you about November and December of 2019, because those months were quiet in the way that important things are sometimes quiet before they stop being quiet. The cereal rye on the south field kept growing. It grew slowly, the way cool season grasses grow, putting more energy into roots than into the above-ground growth that you could see. By the end of November, the plants were 4 to 6 inches tall above the surface, and had root systems reaching down 10 to 14 inches into the soil. By the end of December, the above-ground growth had slowed almost to nothing. The plant was conserving energy for the cold, but the roots had continued to develop, reaching 18 to 22 inches in some of the better spots, threading through the soil and holding it together the way a net holds water. Nora checked the field every 2 weeks. She walked transects and dug up root samples and measured them and wrote the numbers in the notebook. She took soil moisture readings at 4 locations across the field and compared them to readings from the adjacent bare ground, which was the north field. The same soil type, the same management history except for the cover crop. The cover-cropped field held moisture better. Not dramatically, not the kind of difference you could see with your eyes, but measurably, consistently, 2 to 3 percentage points of volumetric water content across all 4 sampling locations by mid-December. She wrote that down, too. Gene Sievert drove past the south field on his way to town in early December and saw the green. He mentioned it to Dale Crowley at the co-op the next morning. Dale said he'd heard the Delgado girl had put in rye. He said he guessed they'd see how it looked in April. The way he said it suggested he already knew how it would look in April, and that it would confirm what he had said in October, and that would be that. Now, let me tell you about January of 2020, because January is where this story stops being quiet. The winter of 2019 to 2020 was not a normal winter in Pottawatomie County. It was not the worst winter anyone could remember. Old-timers would tell you that 1978 or 1993 were worse in terms of raw cold. But it was a particular kind of difficult that had to do with the pattern of the weather more than the extremes of it. What happened was this. December had been dry and relatively mild, which meant the soil went into January without a good snowpack to insulate it. Then, in the second week of January, a cold front moved through and dropped temperatures to 4 degrees Fahrenheit over 3 consecutive nights. Then it warmed to 38 degrees for 5 days. Then another front pushed temperatures back down to 7 degrees for 4 nights. Then it warmed again. Then it froze again. This freeze-thaw cycling, repeated across 3 weeks, is one of the most destructive forces a bare field can face. Every time the soil freezes, it expands. Every time it thaws, it contracts. The surface layer, which has nothing holding it together, no roots, no plant matter, just exposed aggregates, breaks apart. The structure that took years to build collapses into a fine, loose, vulnerable layer that the wind can move and the spring rain can sheet off of rather than infiltrate. Agronomists call it frost heaving and surface seal formation. Farmers call it losing your ground. Either way, it means the same thing. On the bare fields of Pottawatomie County, January did what January does to bare ground. The surface sealed, the topsoil crusted and cracked, and in some places, on the fields with the highest slopes, even the gentle slopes that Kansas calls hills, the freeze-thaw cycles pulled the surface layer loose enough that the wind began to move it. Not dramatically, not the black blizzards of the 1930s, just a slow, quiet, invisible loss of the top quarter-inch of soil, drifting off the high spots and collecting in the fence lines and the road ditches, going somewhere it was no longer useful. On the south field of the Delgado farm, none of this happened. The cereal rye, with its 18 to 22 inches of root development, held the soil surface together through every freeze-thaw cycle. The roots created channels in the soil that allowed the meltwater from each thaw to infiltrate rather than run off, which meant the field was actually gaining moisture through the January cycles rather than losing it. The above-ground biomass, the 4 to 8 inches of rye growth that had slowed but not stopped, acted as a physical barrier against wind, reducing surface wind speed at ground level by 40 to 60% compared to bare ground. The soil surface on the south field did not seal. It did not crust. It did not move. Nora walked both fields in the last week of January after the third freeze-thaw cycle had completed. She walked the south field first and then the north field, which was bare-fallow, and she took the same measurements in both places. Infiltration rate on the south field, 2.1 inches per hour. Infiltration rate on the north field, 0.6 inches per hour. Bulk density reading at 2-inch depth on the south field, 1.21 grams per cubic centimeter, which is healthy. Bulk density at 2-inch depth on the north field, 1.47 grams per cubic centimeter, which indicates compaction and surface sealing. She dug up a handful of soil from each field and held them side by side. The south field soil held together in a clump. The north field soil fell apart into powder in her palm. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She took photographs. She went home and entered the data into a spreadsheet. That evening, she showed her father the numbers. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the infiltration rate comparison, 2.1 versus 0.6, and he was quiet for a moment. He said that was a significant difference. Nora said yes. He said he wanted to see the field himself in the morning. She said she'd take him. They walked the south field the next morning at first light, Hector in his canvas jacket and Nora in her Carhartt, the ground frozen hard under their boots. Hector knelt down at the field edge and picked up a handful of soil and looked at it the way he had looked at soil for 31 years. He squeezed it. He turned it over. He set it down and walked further into the field and knelt again and did the same thing. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, that the ground felt different. Nora said it was. He stood up and looked across the field, the pale green of the rye running away from them toward the far fence line, and he was quiet for another moment. He said she could plant 200 acres of rye next fall, all 3 fields south of the county road. Nora said thank you. He nodded, and they walked back to the truck, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something, and both of them knew it. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020, because the spring is where the numbers started to become undeniable. Nora terminated the cereal rye in late April using a roller crimper that she had rented from the Kansas State Extension Office in Manhattan, the same piece of equipment she had described to Dale Crowley in October, the one that allowed termination and planting in the same pass. She rolled the rye flat, crimping the stems to kill the plants without herbicide, and planted corn into the standing mat of terminated rye the same day. The operation took longer per acre than conventional planting. It was not a simple process, but it was possible, and she had planned for it, and the corn went in on May 2nd, which was within 3 days of when Hector planted the adjacent bare ground fields. The corn on the south field came up even and strong. There was some early-season competition from the rye mat that slowed emergence slightly. She had expected this. It was in the literature. She had planned her seeding rate to compensate. But by the end of May, the corn had canopied, and the rye mat was decomposing into the soil surface, and the field looked like every other cornfield in the county, except that it wasn't. Nora pulled soil samples from the south field and the north field in mid-May and sent them to the K-State Soil Testing Lab. The results came back 2 weeks later. Available nitrogen in the top 6 inches of soil on the south field, 47 pounds per acre. Available nitrogen in the top 6 inches on the north field, 29 pounds per acre. That was an 18-pound per acre difference, which at that year's nitrogen price of 47 cents per pound translated to $8.46 per acre in fertilizer that Nora had not needed to apply. On 80 acres, that was $676.80 in saved inputs. It was not a fortune, but it was real, and it was the first number in a series of numbers that were going to build into something larger. The summer of 2020 was dry. Not a disaster, not the kind of drought that breaks farms, but a consistent, grinding dryness that settled over central Kansas from late June through August and reduced yields across the county by 10 to 18% compared to the 5-year average. The county extension office reported an average corn yield of 142 bushels per acre for the 2020 season, down from the 168 bushel average of the previous 3 years. Hector's bare-ground cornfields came in at 138 bushels per acre, which was close to the county average and nothing to be ashamed of. The south field came in at 159 bushels per acre. Nora had the combine yield monitor data to prove it. 21 bushels per acre above the county average in a dry year, on the same soil type as the adjacent bare-ground fields. The difference was the water infiltration. The cover-cropped soil, which had maintained its structure through the January freeze-thaw cycles and had been further improved by the decomposing rye mat, absorbed the limited rainfall at twice the rate of the bare fields. In a dry year, that extra water absorption was the difference between a crop that got through August and a crop that didn't. Nora put the numbers in the spreadsheet. Revenue on the south field at $3.85 per bushel, $612.15 per acre. Revenue on the bare ground fields at $3.85 per bushel, $531.30 per acre. Difference, $80.85 per acre. On 80 acres, $6,468 in additional gross revenue, plus $676.80 in saved fertilizer inputs, for a total advantage of $7,144.80 over the bare ground fields in the first year alone. Against a seed cost of $1,200 and a roller crimper rental of $400, the net advantage of the cover crop system in year 1 was $5,544.80 on 80 acres in the first year. She showed her father the spreadsheet. He looked at it for a long time. He said quietly that she should plant all 200 acres this fall, and she should start looking into the sunflower rotation, and he wanted to hear what she thought about the north fields too. Nora said she had already been thinking about the north fields. She said she had some ideas. He said he expected she did. Now, let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that fall, because the co-op is where the county's opinion of things gets formed and reformed, and the county's opinion of Nora Delgado was in the process of being reformed whether Dale Crowley wanted it to be or not. Farmers had driven past the south field all summer. They had seen the yield monitor reports through the county's crop insurance data. They had heard the numbers from Hector at the grain elevator, because Hector was not a man who boasted, but he was also not a man who lied about his yields when someone asked him directly. The numbers got around. Numbers always do in a county with 340 farms and 1 co-op. By September of 2020, 3 farmers had come to Nora directly to ask about the cover crop system. Not to the co-op, not to Dale Crowley, to Nora at the Delgado farm, standing at the field edge, asking questions. She answered every question they asked. She showed them the notebook. She showed them the spreadsheet. She told them about the K-State trials and Dr. Whitfield's research and the Saline County data. 2 of them bought cereal rye seed that fall. One of them called the extension office in Manhattan and asked for a consultation. The extension agent who came out was a young woman named Priya Johansson, who had studied under the same program as Nora, 2 years ahead of her, and who told the farmer that everything Nora had said was correct and that the K-State program had been recommending cover crops in this soil type for 4 years, and that the county had been slow to adopt. She did not say this unkindly. She said it the way people say true things. Dale Crowley heard about the conversations. He sold the cereal rye seed to the 2 farmers who came to buy it. He did not say anything about Nora Delgado while he sold it. His smile, when it appeared, had lost some of its certainty. The fall of 2020 was when Nora planted the 200 acres. She also planted 80 acres of sunflowers on the north field, rotating out of the 4-year corn cycle the way she had proposed at the kitchen table a year earlier. Hector helped her this time. He drove the second tractor while she ran the drill. They finished in 4 days. Rosa brought them lunch in the field on the 3rd day and sat on the tailgate of the pickup while they ate, and she looked at the fields going green with rye in the October light, and she said it was something to see. Hector agreed that it was. Nora ate her sandwich and looked at her notebook and did not say anything, because she was already thinking about next year. Let me tell you about the year 2021, because 2021 was the year the argument ended, even if nobody said so out loud. The sunflowers came in on the north field in August. 2,100 pounds per acre of confection sunflowers sold to a processor in Salina at 21 cents per pound, for a gross revenue of $441 per acre, against the 5-year average corn revenue on that same ground of $412 per acre in a good year and $531 per acre in the better years. The sunflowers were not dramatically superior in gross revenue, but the input costs were lower. Sunflowers require less nitrogen than corn, and the cover crop system had been reducing Nora's fertilizer costs across all her fields. And the crop insurance premium was lower because sunflowers carried different risk than corn, and the combination of factors pushed the net revenue on the sunflower acres above the corn average by $38 per acre. On 80 acres, that was $3,040. Not a fortune, but real. More importantly, the sunflowers broke the corn rootworm pressure that had been building in the north field after 4 years of continuous corn. Corn rootworm is a pest that overwinters in corn ground and emerges in the spring to attack corn roots. It cannot complete its life cycle in sunflower ground. 1 year of sunflowers reset the pest pressure to essentially 0, which meant Nora did not need to apply soil insecticide the following year when she returned the north field to corn, saving $18 to $22 per acre in input costs. She had known this would happen. It was in the notebook. It was in the literature. Dr. Whitfield had told her about it in her junior year, but knowing something and proving it are different things, and 2021 was the year the proof arrived. The cover-cropped fields across all 280 acres showed consistent improvement in soil organic matter readings. The baseline in 2019 had been 2.1% organic matter across the farm, which was typical for the county. By the end of the 2021 growing season, the cover-cropped fields were at 2.6%. Half a percentage point doesn't sound like much, but every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil represents approximately 1,000 pounds of additional organic material per acre, which holds approximately 20 gallons of additional water per acre, which in a dry year is worth more than any input you can buy. Nora knew this. She had put it in the notebook in 2018, sitting in Dr. Whitfield's office in Manhattan, listening to a woman who had spent 30 years watching the numbers prove themselves. Let me tell you about the spring of 2022, because the spring of 2022 was the year that Pottawatomie County faced something it had not faced in a long time, and what happened that spring is the reason people in the county still talk about the Delgado farm. The winter of 2021 to 2022 was the driest on record for the county since 1956. Total precipitation from November through March was 3.2 inches, against a normal of 7.8 inches. The soil went into spring with a moisture deficit that the Extension Office estimated at 4 to 6 inches below normal across the county. When planting season arrived in late April, the bare-fallow fields, which had spent the winter losing what little moisture they received to runoff and evaporation, their sealed surfaces unable to absorb the sparse rain that did fall, were in serious trouble. Soil moisture readings in the top 24 inches were at 30 to 40% of field capacity across most of the county. That is not enough moisture to germinate corn reliably. It is not enough to carry a crop through the critical early growth stages without supplemental rain. Farmers planted anyway, because that is what you do. You plant in April and May, and you pray for rain in June. And sometimes the rain comes, and sometimes it doesn't, and you live with the result either way. Across Pottawatomie County, corn went in the ground in the last week of April and the first 2 weeks of May into soil that was too dry and too hard and too sealed to do what soil is supposed to do. Germination was poor. Stand establishment was uneven. The Extension Office reported germination rates of 65 to 75% across the county, meaning that 1 in 4 seeds planted never became a plant. And even the plants that did emerge were stressed from the beginning, their roots reaching down into soil that had nothing to offer them. On the Delgado farm's cover-cropped fields, the situation was different. The soil moisture readings that Nora took in the last week of April showed 58 to 64% of field capacity in the top 24 inches. Not ideal. Not what a wet spring would give you, but workable, and dramatically better than what the bare fields across the county were showing. The cover crop residue on the surface had reduced evaporation through the winter. The improved soil structure had allowed what little rain did fall to infiltrate rather than run off. The organic matter increase had given the soil more capacity to hold the water it received. All of those things, working together, quietly, invisibly, through a winter when nobody was looking, had put the Delgado fields in a fundamentally different position than the fields around them. Corn germinated at 89% on the cover-cropped ground. Stands were even and strong. The plants came out of the ground on schedule and with the vigor that comes from adequate soil moisture in the germination zone. Nora walked the fields in early May and counted plants per row and wrote the numbers in the notebook and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has been told they are wrong and has waited patiently for the evidence to arrive. The summer of 2022 was as dry as the winter had predicted. Total rainfall from June through August was 6.1 inches, against a normal of 12.4 inches. It was, by any measure, a drought year. Not the catastrophic kind, but the grinding, relentless kind that kills yield slowly rather than all at once. The kind that leaves farmers staring at their fields in August, counting the days until harvest, and trying not to think about the price they'd locked in on their forward contracts. Across Pottawatomie County, the drought did what drought does. The county extension office estimated average corn yields at 118 bushels per acre for 2022, the lowest since 2012. Farmers who had been averaging 150 to 160 bushels per acre in normal years were looking at 100 to 115. Some of the sandier ground in the western part of the county came in below 90. It was a hard year. People who had been farming for 30 years looked at their yields and felt it in a way you only feel when the ground you've worked your whole life refuses to give back what you put into it. The Delgado farm's cover-cropped fields yielded 147 bushels per acre in a county that averaged 118. On the same soil type as the fields around them, Nora had the yield monitor data and the scale tickets and the soil moisture records to document every step of why. The better soil moisture going into the season had given the crop a head start that the bare ground fields never had. The improved water infiltration through the summer, even in a drought, there were small rainfall events of 1/4 to half an inch, and on the cover-cropped fields those events soaked in rather than running off, had kept the crop alive through the worst weeks of August. The higher organic matter had buffered the crop against the worst of the stress. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was the accumulated result of 3 years of decisions that had been made carefully, documented thoroughly, and dismissed publicly. The revenue comparison for 2022 was not subtle. At $6.10 per bushel, drought years push prices up. The cover-cropped fields generated $896.70 per acre. The county average bare ground fields, at 118 bushels and the same price, generated $719.80 per acre. The difference was $176.90 per acre. On 280 acres of cover-cropped ground, that was $49,532 in additional gross revenue compared to what the same acreage would have generated at county average yields. Against a cover crop seed cost of approximately $2,800 for the year and a roller crimper rental of $600, the net advantage was $46,132 in 1 year. In a drought year that had been made possible by 3 years of building the soil to handle exactly this kind of year. Hector sat at the kitchen table that October and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. He looked at the yield monitor maps. He looked at the revenue comparison. He looked at his daughter, who was sitting across the table from him with her hands folded and her face quiet, the way her face was when she had already said what she needed to say and was waiting for the other person to catch up. He said, slowly, that she should decide the rotation, all of it, all 800 acres. She should decide what went where and when, and he would run the equipment and she would make the plan. Nora said she would. He nodded. Rosa, from the counter, said that it was about time. Let me tell you about what happened in November of 2022, because November is when Dale Crowley came to the Delgado farm, and that visit is the part of this story that people in the county remember most clearly even now. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because Dale was a morning person and a co-op person, and the Delgado farm was neither. He drove up in his pickup, and Nora was in the equipment shed checking the drill for the fall planting, and she heard the truck and came out. Dale got out of the truck and stood by the door for a moment. He was wearing his co-op jacket. He looked older than he had 3 years ago, which is what 3 hard years do to a man in the agricultural supply business when the farms around him are struggling. He said he'd been hearing about her yields. He said a lot of farmers in the county had been asking him about cover crops this fall, more than he'd ever had before, and that he wanted to understand the system better so he could help them. He said he thought she might be willing to talk him through it. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said she remembered what he had told her in October of 2019. She said she remembered him telling her that he'd hate to see her spend $1,200 on seed and lose more than that on the back end. She said she remembered Gene Sievert laughing. She said this without anger. She said it the way you say something that happened and that you have not forgotten and that you think the other person should not forget either. Dale looked at the ground. He said he had been wrong about that. He said it simply, the way men say things that cost them something to say. He said the data was pretty clear, and he should have looked at the data before he said what he said. Nora said she appreciated that. She said she would be glad to walk him through the system. She said she would show him the notebook and the spreadsheets and the soil test data and the yield monitor records, and she would give him the K-State extension bulletins and Dr. Whitfield's contact information, and if he wanted to bring farmers out to the field, she would talk to them too. She said the lesson was not that cover crops were a miracle. She said the lesson was that any farm that grows its crops on soil it treats as a substrate rather than a living system is building on a foundation that will eventually fail it, and that the year that foundation fails is always the year the farm can least afford it. She said that drought had always come to Kansas